There are many sorts of cactus in the world, particularly in more arid regions. The variety is considerable, and some species are remarkably successful. Previously, I spoke at some length about the saguaro, one of the largest and most easily recognized members of this group. There is another different sort of cactus that may not be quite so grandiose, but its effects have been felt around the world. Opuntia ficus indica, sometimes known as the prickly pear, is a cactus that has been largely domesticated as a crop plant. It produces edible fruits, and its flattened stems are edible as well. Several species within the genus Opuntia have earned reputations both famous and infamous in many countries over hundreds of years. These cacti look quite different from saguaros. They grow in a segmented fashion as a series of flattened, fleshy stems with generally rounded outlines. These unusual stems are technically known as cladodes, and they fill the same photosynthetic function as the leaves in most other plants. Some Opuntia species are quite small. Opuntia fragilis, commonly known as the little prickly pear, grows to maybe 4 inches in height. Many species are low shrubs, but at the opposite extreme, there are a few rather large species that resemble strange trees, growing to more than 20 feet in height. The majority of cacti within this genus produce edible fruits, approximately the size and shape of pears. However, the similarities pretty well end there, despite the name. In many species, the fruits have spines or irritating hairs, or both, which makes them somewhat less than palatable. They must be peeled, or sanded, or held over an open flame to burn the spines and hairs away before they're suitable for consumption. The fruits of many Opuntia species tend to have a hue somewhere between red and purple when ripe, and the juice can be remarkably messy, especially if one goes for the peeled option. The flavor has been likened to that of a melon or perhaps a kiwi fruit. The flattened stems are also edible and sometimes known as nopales. They may be eaten raw, provided the spines are removed, usually along with the outer skin. They are often fried, grilled, or sautéed as well, and added to various dishes. Since Opuntia cacti can often clonally reproduce by simply having parts break off and take root nearby, they can rapidly form colonies of considerable size. This has made them useful, with a bit of guidance, as a natural form of fencing to contain livestock and mark property boundaries. This, combined with their long-standing use as a food source, has led to a fair amount of cultural significance. One of the clearest signs of this impact can be seen on the flag of Mexico. More specifically, the Mexican coat of arms, or the national shield of Mexico. This image depicts an eagle being rather aggressive with a rattlesnake. While the bird and the serpent are both quite imposing, a closer look reveals the eagle to be perching on some sort of Opuntia cactus. Because of their edible fruits, many species in the genus Opuntia are called prickly pears of one variety or another. Generally, the specific name attaches some additional descriptor to the prickly pear designation. For example, there is the desert prickly pear, the jointed prickly pear, and the Florida prickly pear. Other such descriptors include things like plains, prairie, chaparral, eastern, western, beaver tail, cow tongue, discus, tulip, pancake, flapjack, dollar joint, roving, sprawling, shrubby, erect, arborescent, brittle, and inequilateral. There are a lot of species in this genus. To make things even more fun, a lot of these species easily hybridize with one another, so the exact taxonomy is often doubtful at best. With such a variety of species, there is a similar variety in the flowers and pollinators. Bees seem to be the most common pollinators, though some species are visited by hummingbirds instead. Of course, as cacti, these plants are not without their defenses. Most species have ample spines covering their cladodes, clustered around the usual areoles common to the Cactaceae. A striking example of this is seen in Opuntia galapagea, native to the Galapagos Islands. Some of the variants of this large tree-like species have spines extending to almost a foot in length. At the opposite end of the spectrum, a few Opuntia species have a decidedly more insidious form of defense. Opuntia microdacis is commonly known by such innocuous and even cutesy names as angel's wings, bunny ears cactus, bunny cactus, or polka dot cactus. The last of these names refers to the distinctly spotted appearance, as the areoles are easily visible but apparently lacking in spines. The species name, microdacis, roughly translates into tiny hairs, and this is precisely what is found on these pale protuberances. These specialized little hairs are known as glochids. They are barbed and readily detach at even the slightest touch. Their barbed structure gives them a nasty tendency for burrowing into a person's skin, causing a considerable amount of itching and general irritation. Basically, these cacti defend themselves by shedding what amounts to itching powder if anything happens to touch them. While this is bad enough, a more worrisome implication may be found in the name of a related species, Opuntia rufida. This cactus looks quite similar to the polka dot cactus, though its spots are a rusty hue of red rather than pale white or yellow. These two species are sometimes regarded as subspecies within a single species, depending on which specialist you ask. Whatever its actual taxonomy might be, this cactus is commonly known as the blind prickly pear or the cow blinder. This is because the glochids may detach under sufficiently windy conditions, float a considerable distance through the air, and eventually find their way into the eyes of nearby animals. One can probably deduce the effect that this would have. Personally, I think this defensive measure is just a bit excessive. Still, whether excessive or not, no defense is ever perfect. There are a number of creatures that feed quite happily on Opuntia. One of the smallest, with perhaps the largest overall impact, is the scale insect Dactylopius coccus, sometimes known as the Cochineal. These tiny insects only live on the various Opuntia species. They subsist on sap extracted from the plant by a set of piercing, sucking mouthparts. The winged males are short-lived, and the younger nymphs are fairly mobile. Adult females are considerably more sedentary. At a glance, these insects appear as little more than collections of untidy, whitish powder on the cactus stems. Beneath this powdery exterior is a creature with a deep burgundy hue. This color is due to the presence of carminic acid, which normally acts as a deterrent to predators. A dried female cochineal insect may be up to 1/4 carminic acid by weight. That is, 1 gram out of every 4 is carminic acid. This substance can be extracted and treated by various methods to produce differing hues of vibrant red dye. These dyes were used in the New World for centuries, if not millennia, before the Spaniards brought them to the Old World. For hundreds of years afterward, carmine, which is derived from cochineal extract, was a unique and highly sought-after red dye throughout Europe. Even today, cochineal is used as a dye in fabric, cosmetics, and foods. It even finds use in histological studies as a stain in slide preparation, used to give tissue samples a vibrant pink hue. Cochineal was such a precious commodity, the insect and its supporting cactus has been cultivated in several regions outside of its original home. One of the most disastrous of these introductions occurred in Australia in 1788. By some accounts, the prickly pear was brought in as a food source for livestock, or perhaps for use as natural fencing as seen in the Americas and parts of Europe. It seems at least one of the reasons for the introduction was an attempt at cochineal farming. If this was the intention, it did not work out. For whatever reason, the scale insects weren't well suited to Australian life at the time and soon died off. The cactus, however, seemed to be very well adapted to its new home. Opuntia aurantiaca, also known as the tiger pear, was especially well suited to life down under. Over the next century, the imported Opuntia managed to spread out over close to 100,000 square miles of eastern Australia. Some of the more dramatic accounts describe farms choked out by unending expanses of hellish green vegetation. The plants were said to grow over 20 feet tall in places, forming an impenetrable jungle of vicious spines, sufficient to drive farmers off of their land. The abandoned buildings were eventually overgrown and crushed by this invasive cactus growth. In the mid to late 1920s, the growth was brought down to more manageable levels by importing populations of the South American cactus moth, Cactoblastus cactorum. As one might guess from both the common and scientific names, the caterpillars of this unassuming little moth feed upon the prickly pear. By the early 1930s, almost all of the invasive prickly pear cacti had been eaten away by the moths. This was so effective that, in 1936, the Cactoblastus Memorial Hall was built in southeastern Queensland, near the town of Chinchilla in the Western Downs region. It remains one of the more successful examples of biological control to this day. In a final touch of irony, the Cochineal insect is also used today for ongoing biological control of Opuntia in this region. The prickly pear was also introduced into South Africa in the 1700s. It thrived there as well, though for whatever reason it had a more positive overall effect. It has been well regarded as a food source by many residents, but the overall history and attitudes were somewhat complicated, and often contradictory. As with Australia, biological control agents were eventually introduced in the 1930s, reducing the overall population of prickly pears within the area. It would seem that in its current controlled state, the plant is well appreciated by the general public there. Opuntia species have also been introduced to several countries in Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean. Original imports were brought over as early as the 16th century. Today, the plants can be found all around the Mediterranean, both in northern Africa and southern Europe. They are generally not regarded as an invasive species at this point. Interestingly enough, the prickly pear is used in some areas to prevent deserts from spreading. Certain species, like Opuntia monoacantha, are noted for their dense root systems that prevent soil erosion. As they are adapted to thrive in arid conditions, droughts don't especially trouble them, at least not compared to many other plants. So, while there are certainly a few horror stories, particularly on Australia, I would say that the genus Opuntia has been fairly helpful overall throughout the centuries. Whether as fencing or a food source, ground cover or ecological engineer, these resilient plants have become a vital part of many arid places. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the more unusual side of the natural world. If you wish to know more, here are a few things that might be worth looking into. If you found this enjoyable, feel free to leave a like. If you think others would enjoy this content, by all means, share. If you have something to say or ask about, honest comments are always welcome. If you wish to see more from this channel, a subscription would be most helpful. Until next time.